Boa noite. The Honesty Hour. My childhood and early adolescence were a mess. Perhaps they were even, or there were moments when they were a nightmare. I don't even know where to begin. But I'm going to begin here because I was just thinking how my own twin brother, fraternal twin brother, Jeff, was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic in his early 20s. I remember I was on a long overland trip from Europe to India, and I got a letter when I arrived in India from my mother saying that my brother Jeff had been in a mental hospital. I don't remember exactly what the letter said. It was so long ago. We're talking 1979. No, it would have been 1977. And all of these years later, and in 1979, he committed a suicide by jumping off a cliff into the ocean and drowning. But why I remember this now is that I've realized that I too went through I don't want to say at all identical, but a similar or a mirror experience when I was younger. I was not diagnosed with a mental illness. I might have been mentally ill or disturbed. I fortunately pulled out of it. I remember, and it was paranoia. There was some delusion involved too. I'm trying to remember the first manifestation was when I was in late elementary, very early junior high school. I started to have paranoid ideas that I was going to be poisoned, or more specifically, that I was going to get lockjaw. Yes, it was lockjaw. We lived on a big farm, a big estate. My stepfather was a gentleman farmer with delusions of being a farmer, although he was born and bred in Manhattan. He was a television executive. Unfortunately, I got dragged into it as a stepchild. And we lived on a big farm with cows and horses. And the house was built in the year 1793, so it was very old, beautiful but old, lots of dirt, lots of horse and cow manure, lots of breeding grounds for tetanus. And I became paranoid that I was going to puncture, usually my foot, and get lockjaw, tetanus. And I remember around 6th, 7th grade, always opening and closing my jaw, convinced that it was getting tight. Of course, I realize now that that was an early manifestation of my own deep anxieties, my suppressed traumas about knowing that I was gay at a very, very young age. I'm talking about realization that I was gay at the age of early 4. We're talking in the late 1950s. And all of the trauma that goes along with that from adults and childhood peers of that era. And I'm sure that these manifestations I'm going to mention are a result of that. So there was the lockjaw phase. Then, at the end of 7th grade, the summer before 8th grade, my mother left that stepfather when we suddenly moved down to Sarasota, Florida, where her parents, my grandparents lived. A very sudden escape. And I remember I was walking home from my new junior high school in Indialantic, Florida, where she had married and settled in Melbourne Beach, Florida, with father number 3, husband number 3. A car. Well, I noticed a car whiz by, and the guy was looking at me, the driver. I noticed him. I noted it. But then the car must have turned at the next block, and he circled the block, and when I came to the corner, ready to cross the street, there was that car and that driver, and he was looking at me. Raised alarm bells. I crossed the street nervously in front of him, walked to the next block. Meanwhile, he had circled, and when I reached the next block, the corner, there he was. The same car, the same driver, and I realized that I was being followed. It was probably, a creepy, guy who was into young junior high school kids. And it happened again at the third corner, kept circling, and when I would get at the corner, he would look at me with a creepy look, and I got very frightened. I remember walking quickly down the main street of the town of Indialantic and going into the police station and calling the phone number in there, and there was no police in there, and the policeman patrol pulled up and they drove me home. He drove me home. But that planted a paranoia in my head. And for, I'm not sure, but a good year and a half, maybe even 2 years, I spent that time very paranoid that I was being followed by a car. And I was constantly on the lookout for cars. If I saw a car, and then if I imagined that I saw it again, it would make me feel panicky. I never again did anything about it. I never went to the police again, but it was very nerve-wracking. It was very disturbing. Obviously now, as an adult, at 70 years old, I can see how this kind of paranoia wormed its way into my brain. I would say it's pretty classic paranoia of suppressed sexuality, fear of my gayness. And we're talking, I was only 13, 14 years old. This is very young. Thank God, all of that paranoia, fear, delusion disappeared when my mother left, husband number 3. We once again suddenly left. This time we suddenly left Florida and were put on a plane to my biological father in Los Angeles. Well, within an hour of arriving, I knew he was a mess. The word I use to describe him now is a narcissistic sociopath. I didn't have that kind of vocabulary again, but I knew he was nuts. Talking to the walls. He totally seduced my brother into believing in this psycho-sick, toxic religious cult that he had formed. I stayed away. I thank God. Enrolled in the 11th grade of high school, was heavily involved in Hollywood High theater department, morning, noon, and night. I was the first one there. I was the last one to leave. I was there every weekend when I could be. Even at summer school, I was in the play production. And I stayed away from him and home as much as possible, but my brother didn't. I think some pretty nasty, horrible, frightening things happened in that little mini cult of my father, which he called Mandala. But it cured me in a way of my own paranoia, because now I was experiencing, witnessing, observing something that was not a psychotic paranoia delusion, but something that was shockingly and frighteningly real, and I want nothing to do with it. I mean, everything short of hanging garlic over my bed and a cross around my neck. I did. My brother finally realized the sickness of it all, and he got on a plane and went back to New York where my mother had settled. I did go back to New York for 6 months, but realized that my heart was not with my father, but it was in Los Angeles. And I flew back to California and spent the rest of my adult life in California, not in Los Angeles, but made San Francisco, California, my home. But my brother, unfortunately, I went from frightening fantasy and delusion to being somehow curing myself or being cured by reality. By the time I was 15, all of that had disappeared from my psyche, to my brother experiencing it in reality, but it's sending him over the edge. And on that trip a few years later to India, my cross-continent trip from London to Calcutta, I got that letter from my mother, and sure enough, my brother was hospitalized, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, thinking that people were following him, that people were after him. Sound familiar? Well, I had already experienced it. But I didn't have a psychotic breakdown. I was never diagnosed with a serious mental illness like schizophrenia. My brother did not survive. He committed suicide at 24 in San Francisco, jumped off a cliff into the ocean, into the pounding surf at Seal Rocks. But now, at this advanced age, I'm able to put two and two together. I never wanted to really think about it when I was in my, after that happened, in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I didn't think about it. I only wanted to look forward to. I didn't dwell on it. I think it was just the idea, subconsciously, the idea of examining it was too frightening, too pushing me too close to the edge, too risky. And so I just moved forward. And I moved forward well, and I'm okay. But I realize now, it's so interesting the way my twin brother and I had a similar internal nightmare, but mine happened much earlier, and I was able to climb out of it, and I was never submerged by it, whereas my brother was submerged by it. It developed suddenly into psychosis and schizophrenia, and he drowned, literally and figuratively. Just a side note, schizophrenia runs in my father's family. I subsequently learned, when I studied my family genealogy, that my father's grandmother, my paternal great-grandmother, was in her early adulthood, admitted to the Idaho State Insane Asylum, as it was called in the early 19th century, for mental illness. The records are gone, so I don't know what the diagnosis, or even if they would have given her a diagnosis in a state mental institution called the Idaho State Insane Asylum, if they had the sophistication to diagnose schizophrenia. But I imagine it was schizophrenia. As I said, schizophrenia has a genetic component. That gene missed me, but not my brother. But it's interesting that we both experienced similar symptoms, but somehow I managed. I don't want to say I was stronger or brighter. I think he was brighter than I was in many ways. He had published a book by the time he was 22 years old. But I was more resilient. I had better survival skills. And the way I had protected myself from my father's madness had perhaps protected me from what happened to my brother. Anyway, I find it interesting. Perhaps someday a clinician, psychiatrist, doctor would like to examine my case. But I just wanted to share it here on this late night here in this small, isolated city that I live in Bahia, Brazil, where I find myself in my later years. I've taken my own trips. My brother did once mention this. He said, because he was heavy into astrology. I am not, in the least. But he said, isn't it interesting? We both had we're both born at the same hour, the same date, at the same place. He said, looking at our chart, at the same times in our life, we both took journeys. He took an internal journey, a nightmarish journey, a journey that had him running from imaginary enemies chasing him and ultimately led to his death. And I was also on a journey that time. I became a compulsive traveler, trips to India, Europe, and then my focus became Latin America, and here I find myself in Brazil. But that was also another interesting insight that he had. Anyway, I'm going to leave you now on this night, this hot night in Brazil. Thanks for listening and joining me. Boa noite. Good night.